billionaire cowboy in a wheelchair sat alone at a wedding until a ranch widow said, "Dance with me." The wedding was set on a sprawling ranch, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by rolling hills and open fields that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. It was a warm spring afternoon, and the air carried the soft scent of wildflowers mingling with the earthy smell of the ranch. Guests had arrived in their Sunday best, their polished shoes crunching softly on the gravel paths as they greeted one another with laughter, hugs, and polite small talk. Children ran around, chasing butterflies and occasionally tumbling into the grass, while older guests leaned on canes or strolled with arms linked, enjoying the peaceful rhythm of the countryside. Near the edge of the main gathering, away from the clusters of chatting guests, sat a man who drew more attention than anyone else, even though he did nothing to seek it. He was tall, with broad shoulders that still hinted at the strength he had once carried on horseback and in the work of the ranches he owned. His face, weathered by years of sun and wind, held a rugged handsomeness that seemed to belong to another era, an era of hard work, resilience, and quiet dignity. But today he sat in a wheelchair, his legs no longer able to carry him over the rough terrain he had once conquered effortlessly. He wore a simple suit, dark but well-fitted, paired with a crisp white shirt and a plain tie. His boots, polished but scuffed along the edges, spoke of a life spent riding horses, walking through mud, and working with hands that built things from nothing. His eyes, a clear shade of gray, scanned the scene before him, not in boredom but with careful observation. He noticed everything: the way the sunlight glinted on the bride's dress, the way children laughed without worry, the subtle smiles exchanged between longtime friends, and the quiet moments of connection between strangers. Yet despite the life unfolding around him, there was a stillness about him, a kind of calm separation. The guests noticed him too, of course. Whispers began as soon as someone recognized who he was. "That's him," a woman murmured to her friend, nodding toward the wheelchair at the edge. "The billionaire cowboy." Another voice, a little louder and tinged with curiosity, asked, "Why is he sitting alone?" People looked at him with admiration, some with a touch of envy, and others with the polite distance often given to someone whose reputation precedes them. He had built a fortune from ranching businesses that spanned states, yet he carried no arrogance. His presence alone seemed to command respect, even though he made no effort to draw attention. But beneath the admiration, there was also a hint of unease among the guests. Some did not know how to approach him. He was a man of means, yes, but he was also a man who had suffered. Years ago, a riding accident had changed his life forever. A broken spine had confined him to a wheelchair, and with it came not just physical limitations but emotional struggles that few could understand. People remembered stories of his strength and determination, but they also whispered about the loneliness that had followed. Some believed his wealth could shield him from hardship, but those who knew better understood that money could not replace the life he had lost, the freedom of movement, or the simple pleasures of walking across his ranch on a quiet morning. As the music began to play, couples started to move toward the dance floor. The bride, glowing with happiness, held her husband's hand tightly as they stepped together, smiling at each other in a way that made others around them pause and watch. Laughter and conversation filled the air, mingling with the sound of the gentle breeze rustling through the trees and the occasional whinny of a distant horse. Yet, amid all this life and celebration, the man in the wheelchair remained seated, watching but not participating. He had learned over the years to appreciate moments like this quietly. He did not crave attention, nor did he desire pity. He simply observed. He watched the way people moved, the way they interacted, the way life continued around him even though his own path had been dramatically altered. Memories of his younger years floated into his mind. He remembered the thrill of riding across wide-open fields, feeling the wind against his face, the power of a horse beneath him, and the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. He remembered the long days and longer nights, the challenges that had once seemed insurmountable, and the victories that had come from persistence and determination. But those memories were now tinged with longing. He felt the absence of companionship, the quiet loneliness that often accompanied success. Friends came and went, some staying for a while, some disappearing altogether. Business associates respected him, but respect is not the same as connection. He had people around him, yes, but they were often more interested in his achievements than in him as a person. And so he sat alone, not bitter but reflective, carrying the weight of a life that had given him so much, and yet taken away certain freedoms that he had once taken for granted. Despite this solitude, there was something undeniably magnetic about him. People were drawn to him without even trying. They felt the aura of strength, resilience, and experience that radiated quietly. Some admired the way he maintained his dignity despite his limitations. Others wondered about the man behind the public image of wealth and power. There was a story there, one that was evident in his eyes, in the way he carried himself, and in the subtle expressions that crossed his face. It was a story of triumph, of struggle, of resilience, and of humanity. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the open field, he continued to watch the wedding unfold. He noticed the small, joyful moments that others might miss. A child handing a flower to a laughing bride, an elderly couple holding hands, a friend quietly helping another with a spilled drink. These were the moments that reminded him of the quiet beauty of life, of connections that did not require wealth, status, or power. They reminded him of the simple joys that could still exist, even in a world that often focused on achievement and material success. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to participate fully again. Not in business, not in strategy meetings, not in the transactions that had defined so much of his life, but in the simple, human experiences of joy, connection, and companionship. He thought about dancing, about laughter, about sharing a moment with someone who could see him, not for his wealth or status, but for who he truly was. It was a longing he rarely allowed himself to feel, yet it lingered quietly in the back of his mind, like a soft whisper reminding him that life was not just about endurance, but about presence, feeling, and being seen. Even as he sat, alone yet not unnoticed, the man carried himself with quiet pride. He did not need others to validate his life, though validation was something humans naturally crave. Instead, he carried the weight of experience, of lessons learned, and of resilience forged through adversity. And in that quiet observation, in the stillness that separated him from the rest of the celebration, there was a profound dignity, a sense that despite life's twists and turns, he had endured, survived, and remained true to himself. As the wedding continued around him, he made a silent decision. He would remain present in his own way, observing the beauty of the day, acknowledging the joy of others, and holding space for the possibility of something unexpected. He did not yet know what that might be, but deep down, he felt a small flicker of hope, a reminder that life could still surprise him, even after all he had been through. And so he sat there, a solitary figure in a wheelchair, watching the world go by, carrying a life full of stories, resilience, and quiet strength, waiting, unknowingly, for the moment that would change everything. Among the guests at the wedding was a woman whose presence carried a quiet strength. She had been a ranch widow for several years, her life shaped by both loss and resilience. The death of her husband had left a deep emptiness, a silence that sometimes echoed in her heart during lonely evenings. Yet instead of allowing sorrow to define her, she had chosen to continue living fully, managing the ranch her husband had loved, tending to her animals, and welcoming life in its own unpredictable way. Her hands were strong, calloused from hard work, and her eyes held a calm determination that seemed to shine even in ordinary moments. From the moment she arrived at the wedding, her gaze wandered naturally across the gathering. She noticed the joyful laughter, the sparkling dresses, and the couples holding hands in happiness. But her attention was soon drawn to a figure that most others barely acknowledged. At the edge of the celebration, a man sat alone in a wheelchair, his posture upright, his eyes scanning the scene with quiet intensity. She had heard stories about him, the billionaire cowboy, a man whose life had been filled with achievement, adventure, and tragedy. She had read about his ranching empire, his fortune, and the accident that had confined him to a wheelchair. But stories, she knew, could only capture a fraction of a person's true self. There was something about him that piqued her curiosity, not his wealth, nor his reputation, but the quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. Unlike many who relied on attention or status, he seemed self-contained, observing without demanding recognition. His presence was calm yet commanding, and she sensed a depth in him that went beyond the surface of headlines and rumors. While others whispered and speculated, she felt an instinctive empathy. She knew the feeling of being seen as one thing while being so much more. She had lived it herself, judged not for her abilities but for the circumstances life had imposed upon her. The widow approached him slowly, not with hesitation but with care. She had no desire to impress him with words, no need to showcase herself, only the intention to connect. She recognized that approaching someone like him required respect, respect for his space, his dignity, and the invisible battles he had fought. She walked through the soft grass, the subtle crunch beneath her boots marking each step as deliberate. Her eyes never left his, not in a challenging way, but in a way that conveyed understanding. When she reached him, she offered a simple smile. "Hello," she said softly, her voice warm without being intrusive. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging her presence with a calm, measured gaze. For a moment, neither spoke, as if they were sizing one another up, not in judgment but in recognition of shared experience. The widow continued, "I don't think anyone has asked you to join in yet. You seem a little out of place here, though you don't seem to mind." He regarded her quietly, intrigued. Most people either avoided him or spoke awkwardly, unsure whether to treat him as an equal, a curiosity, or an untouchable figure. But she spoke naturally, with honesty and no hidden agenda. There was no pity in her words, no flattery, just a gentle acknowledgement of his presence. He felt a flicker of relief, a small, unexpected light in a room full of polite strangers and distant admirers. "I'm not out of place," he replied finally, his voice calm, deep, and slightly roughened by years of speaking little outside of work. "I watch. That's enough for me." She nodded, understanding more in that simple statement than he realized. She too had often watched life from the sidelines, learning, observing, and waiting for moments that mattered. "Sometimes," she said gently, "watching is enough, but sometimes life surprises you when you take a chance." For the first time in hours, he allowed himself a small smile. There was a sincerity in her tone, a kind of honesty he had rarely encountered in social gatherings. Most people either wanted something from him or were intimidated by his wealth and reputation. Here was someone who saw him as a person, not a headline. That alone was enough to intrigue him. Their conversation began simply, with introductions and small talk about the ranch and the wedding. She shared stories of her own life, of managing the ranch after her husband's passing, of learning to be self-reliant, and of finding moments of joy despite the hardships she had faced. She spoke with a mixture of humility and pride, revealing her resilience without exaggeration. He listened carefully, occasionally nodding, sometimes asking quiet questions, always attentive. For him, this was refreshing. Conversations with strangers usually felt superficial, but with her, there was a depth that he had not experienced in years. As they continued to talk, she noticed the subtle ways he carried himself. His hands rested lightly on the armrests of his wheelchair, strong and capable, yet marked with the faint scars of a life filled with labor. His eyes moved with a mix of curiosity and wariness, as if he had learned to measure every interaction carefully. She did not feel intimidated. Instead, she felt drawn to the strength beneath his quiet exterior. There was a story there, one that could not be captured in articles or gossip. The music played on in the background, soft melodies drifting across the open field. Guests were beginning to gather on the dance floor, laughing and twirling in time with the rhythm. She glanced toward the dancing couples and then back at him, noting the way he watched the scene. There was no envy, no longing that he openly displayed, just a quiet observation, a presence that seemed both detached and fully aware. She felt a small surge of admiration. Here was a man who had faced unimaginable challenges and yet had maintained his dignity, his composure, and his humanity. "Would you like to join me for a walk?" she asked suddenly, surprising even herself. She did not mean a physical walk, knowing the limitations imposed by his wheelchair, but she meant it in a metaphorical sense, a step toward connection, a chance to engage beyond casual observation. He considered her words for a moment, then nodded slightly. "I would like that," he said. His voice carried a warmth that had been absent for a long time, a willingness to step beyond the safety of solitude. They moved together along the edge of the gathering, talking quietly. She did not rush the conversation, nor did she push him to share more than he wanted. Instead, they found a rhythm in their exchange, each story building upon the other, each word reinforcing a growing trust. They spoke of ranch life, of the challenges of managing animals and land, of the simple pleasures found in early mornings and quiet evenings. They laughed softly at shared experiences, the kind of laughter that comes from genuine understanding rather than amusement at trivialities. As the sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, a subtle change occurred. The cowboy felt something he had not felt in years, a sense of ease, of being truly seen by another person. He realized that while he had spent much of his life building businesses, acquiring wealth, and maintaining appearances, there had been very few moments in which he could simply exist as himself without judgment or expectation. Here in the presence of this widow, he experienced that rare gift. She too felt the connection. She had approached him with no expectations, no assumptions, yet she found herself intrigued by his quiet strength, his resilience, and the way he carried himself through life's hardships. There was a warmth that extended beyond mere conversation, a silent acknowledgement of shared humanity that neither of them could easily explain. As the evening deepened and the music grew softer, they remained close to the edge of the wedding. They spoke less about themselves and more about the world they had both navigated, the trials, the victories, the losses, and the quiet moments of grace that life sometimes offered. The cowboy realized that he was not just observing her presence, but actively participating in it, finding comfort in the simple act of connection. The widow noticed subtle changes in him as well. She saw the way his eyes softened, the slight lifting of his shoulders, and the brief smiles that appeared when he shared a memory or responded to something she said. It was clear that her attention, simple and unassuming, had reached him in a way that few others had. She recognized that people often treat those with wealth or power with distance or awe, but she had approached him with nothing but sincerity, and it had made a difference. As twilight settled over the ranch, the cowboy and the widow continued to share quiet moments together. Guests continued to dance, laugh, and celebrate, but for them, the world seemed to narrow into a space of understanding and presence. Words became less necessary as they simply enjoyed each other's company, the shared silence as meaningful as conversation. It was a rare connection, forged not through circumstance or convenience, but through mutual recognition of strength, resilience, and humanity. By the time the stars began to appear, twinkling softly over the open fields, the cowboy felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years: hope. Not the kind of fleeting hope tied to ambition or success, but a quiet, enduring hope that connection was possible, that moments of genuine understanding could exist, and that life could offer surprises even after hardship. The widow, too, felt a renewed sense of possibility, a reminder that genuine connections can appear in the most unexpected moments, without fanfare or pretense. As the wedding carried on around them, with music, laughter, and celebration filling the night air, they remained near one another, their presence a quiet acknowledgement that even in a crowded world, two people could find understanding and companionship. It was a beginning, subtle and unassuming, yet profoundly meaningful. Neither knew where it might lead, but both sensed that something important had begun, a bridge between two lives shaped by resilience, loss, and quiet courage. In that moment, the world beyond the ranch seemed to fade. The grandeur of the wedding, the whispers of the guests, the distant hills, and the wide sky all became part of a backdrop for a simpler truth. Genuine human connection matters more than wealth, more than status, and more than appearances. It was in this quiet presence, this shared understanding, that the cowboy and the widow discovered a rare and valuable gift: being seen, truly and without judgment, by another soul. The music at the wedding shifted as the evening progressed. A soft, slow melody began to play, one that seemed made for couples to sway gently together. The dance floor, which had been lively with laughter and spinning gowns, quieted a little as the rhythm changed, inviting a more intimate movement. Guests glanced around, taking someone's hand or finding a familiar partner, letting the music guide them in steps that were simple yet meaningful. The cowboy remained at the edge, still in his wheelchair, observing the scene as he had throughout the day. His eyes followed the dancers, noting the joy, the small smiles, and the way couples seemed to communicate without words. He watched the way hands intertwined, how people leaned on each other, and the subtle confidence that comes from trusting another person in a simple, shared motion. He felt a mixture of longing and hesitance. He had not danced in years, not since the accident that changed his life, and the thought of moving in that way again brought both anticipation and anxiety. The widow, noticing his quiet gaze, felt a gentle pull toward him. She had seen the quiet loneliness, the subtle isolation that wealth and reputation often fail to mask. She recognized the way he observed life without fully participating, and something inside her stirred. She felt that connection, the one they had begun to form during their earlier conversation, calling for a new step, a small act that could bridge the gap between watching and joining, between solitude and shared experience. She moved closer to him, her steps deliberate and unhurried. When she reached him, she smiled with warmth that carried no judgment, no expectation, only the simple, honest invitation that comes from understanding another person. "Would you like to dance with me?" she asked softly, her voice carrying across the gentle hum of the wedding. The question caught him off guard. He blinked, momentarily silent, unsure how to respond. Not because he did not want to, but because it had been so long since anyone had asked him to step beyond his isolation in such a human, simple way. He had grown accustomed to people either avoiding him or treating him differently because of his wheelchair. But here was someone who saw him, not as a curiosity, not as a headline, but as a man capable of connection and presence. I, I don't know," he admitted after a pause, his voice quiet but steady. "It's been a long time." She reached out gently, placing her hand near his armrest, careful to respect his space. "It doesn't have to be perfect," she said kindly. "It's just a dance, just two people enjoying a song. That's all." Her words were simple, yet they carried reassurance that was hard to resist. They were not asking him to perform or impress anyone. They were simply inviting him to share a moment. He studied her for a long moment, noticing the calm in her eyes, the confidence in her gesture, and the warmth in her tone. Something inside him softened, a wall he had built over years of solitude and independence slowly lowering, just enough to allow a small step toward connection. With a slight nod, he agreed. "All right," he said quietly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. She guided him carefully toward the edge of the dance floor, moving at a pace that was comfortable for both of them. The music swelled slightly, wrapping around them like a soft, invisible embrace. Guests glanced at them with curiosity, some whispering, others smiling quietly. But the cowboy paid little attention. In that moment, the world outside the rhythm of the song did not matter. There was no wealth, no reputation, no expectations. Only two people, a shared song, and the simple act of moving together. As they positioned themselves, the widow reached out to guide his hands gently. "Just follow my lead," she said softly. "We'll move together." He hesitated for a brief second, recalling the awkwardness of years without dancing, but then he trusted her, allowing himself to be guided. Their movements were slow, tentative at first, a careful exploration of how they could exist together in that space. There was no rush, no need to impress, only the quiet beauty of cooperation and trust. The cowboy felt something unfamiliar yet comforting. He felt the presence of another human being, fully aware of him, fully accepting him. It was a sensation that had been missing from his life for a long time, hidden beneath layers of independence, success, and solitude. The widow's presence was grounding, her calm confidence giving him permission to let go of fear and embrace the moment. As they moved, he became aware of the subtle movements of the dance floor around them. Couples swayed in harmony, hands occasionally brushing, eyes meeting with unspoken communication. He noticed the way laughter filled the air, the soft rustle of dresses, and the gentle tapping of feet on the wooden floor. He began to feel connected, not just to the widow beside him, but to the world unfolding around him. It was a gentle reminder that life could still include moments of joy and shared experience, even after loss and hardship. The widow's smile never wavered as she guided him through the dance. "You're doing fine," she whispered, noticing his initial stiffness easing into a natural rhythm. "Just enjoy it. Feel the music. Don't think too much." Her words were simple, yet powerful, carrying the encouragement that had been missing in his life for years. He felt a sense of relief, realizing that he did not need to perform, impress, or control anything. He could simply exist, simply move, simply enjoy. As the song continued, their movements became smoother, more confident. He began to match her rhythm, following the gentle cues of her hand and the subtle shifts in her stance. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of freedom, not in his body, which remained limited by the accident, but in his spirit. The act of sharing a dance, simple and human, brought a joy that he had not allowed himself to feel for a long time. The guests began to notice the pair, watching with quiet admiration. Some whispered, amazed by the connection between the billionaire cowboy and the widow who had approached him, without hesitation or pretense. Others looked on with smiles, sensing the quiet courage it took for both of them to step beyond their comfort zones. But neither the cowboy nor the widow paid attention to the onlookers. Their focus was entirely on each other, on the rhythm of the song, and on the subtle, profound exchange that occurred with every movement, every glance, and every shared breath. He remembered the first time he had ever danced, long ago at another wedding. Back then, he had moved with confidence, unaware of the world around him, lost in the simple joy of motion and music. The memory was bittersweet, filled with nostalgia for the past and awareness of what he had lost. Yet in this moment, he realized that memories were not chains. They were reminders that life could evolve, that joy could return, and that new experiences could replace old losses in ways that were just as meaningful. The widow noticed the change as well. She saw the tension in his shoulders ease, the subtle lifting of his chin, and the sparkle in his eyes that had been absent for years. She felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that her simple invitation had allowed someone to reconnect with a part of themselves they thought was lost. It was a quiet triumph, one that required no applause or acknowledgement from anyone else. The dance was its own reward. For several minutes, they moved together in silence, allowing the music to guide them. Words were unnecessary. Their presence and the rhythm of the song conveyed everything. In the simple act of dancing, they shared a moment of trust, understanding, and human connection that transcended social status, wealth, or circumstance. He realized that in those few minutes, he was not defined by the wheelchair, the accident, or his reputation. He was simply a man enjoying a dance, a song, and the company of someone who saw him fully. As the final notes of the song lingered in the air, they came to a gentle stop. The cowboy felt a quiet warmth, a sense of peace and connection that he had not experienced in years. He looked at the widow, and for the first time that evening he allowed himself to smile fully, without restraint or reservation. "Thank you," he said softly. "I didn't realize how much I needed this." She smiled back, her eyes reflecting understanding and compassion. "Sometimes," she said, "we just need someone to remind us that life can still be simple and beautiful." In that moment, the world around them seemed to fade into the background. The chatter of guests, the clinking of glasses, and the distant hills all became a quiet backdrop to a profound human connection. They had shared something rare, a moment of true presence, a bridge between solitude and companionship, a reminder that joy and understanding can appear in unexpected ways. As they returned to their seats, the cowboy felt lighter, as if the dance had lifted a weight he had carried for years. The widow remained nearby, her presence calm and reassuring. Though neither spoke immediately, the shared glance and quiet acknowledgement were enough to convey the unspoken truth. Life had a way of surprising those who allowed themselves to be open, vulnerable, and willing to trust. The night continued, but the cowboy no longer felt like an observer at the edge of life. He had stepped into it, even briefly, and had experienced the joy of being seen, of connecting, and of participating. The widow had not only invited him to dance, she had invited him back into the world of human experience, reminding him that even after loss, pain, and isolation, life could still offer moments of beauty, connection, and hope. As the stars appeared in the sky above the ranch, twinkling softly against the deepening night, he reflected on the rarity of such moments. He realized that courage is not only about facing danger or achieving success, it is also about allowing oneself to be vulnerable, to accept kindness, and to take small steps toward connection. The dance had been a small act, but its impact was profound. The cowboy knew, deep in his heart, that this night was different. Something had shifted, a subtle yet undeniable change in the way he viewed himself, others, and the possibility of connection. The widow had reminded him that life could still surprise, that joy could still exist, and that even those who seemed untouchable or isolated could experience moments of profound human connection. The night had grown deeper, and the stars above the ranch shone brightly, scattered across the vast sky like diamonds. The wedding continued with laughter, quiet conversation, and soft music that floated through the cool night air. The warmth of the day had faded, replaced by a gentle evening chill that made people huddle together or wrap their arms around one another. For most guests, the night was coming to a close, but for the cowboy and the widow, it felt like a beginning. After the dance, they returned to their seats near the edge of the gathering. He wheeled himself slowly, careful not to draw too much attention, yet unable to hide the small glow of contentment that had appeared on his face. She remained by his side, offering quiet conversation and light-hearted remarks, creating a natural rhythm between them. The other guests noticed them occasionally, but for once they didn't matter. The world had narrowed down to a small space of mutual understanding, and that was enough. They talked about ordinary things at first: the ranch, the weather, the way the music had carried them through the dance. Yet in the simplicity of those words, there was a depth that neither of them needed to explain. It was as if the act of sharing a moment together had opened a door that had long been closed. He felt a connection that went beyond casual conversation, beyond polite curiosity, beyond the roles they had played in life. It was a genuine human bond, quiet but strong. The widow noticed subtle changes in him. She saw the lines of worry that usually lingered around his eyes soften. She noticed the way his shoulders relaxed, and the small smiles that came and went as he recalled the joy of the dance. There was a lightness in his presence, a sense of ease that was new and refreshing. She, too, felt a shift within herself. Though she had spent years rebuilding her life after loss, she realized that genuine connection could still surprise her, even when she thought she had become accustomed to solitude. They spoke of their pasts, not as a list of achievements or tragedies, but as stories that shaped who they had become. The cowboy shared memories of his childhood on the ranch, the long days spent tending cattle, the nights under the stars, and the small victories that had led him to build a vast ranching empire. He spoke of the accident that had changed his life, the physical pain, and the emotional adjustments he had faced in the aftermath. It was a story of resilience, hardship, and determination, one that carried both sorrow and pride. The widow listened attentively, not interrupting or offering platitudes. She understood the value of being present, of hearing without judgment or advice. Her own life had been shaped by similar experiences, and she recognized the courage it took to continue forward despite hardship. She shared her own memories of love lost, of challenges faced alone, and of small triumphs that brought hope back into her life. As they exchanged stories, the conversation became a quiet acknowledgement of their shared humanity. Time seemed to stretch and compress at the same moment. The sounds of the wedding, the laughter of friends, the soft music, and the whispers of the night all became part of a gentle backdrop for the connection unfolding between them. It was a connection not defined by words alone, but by presence, understanding, and mutual respect. Every glance, every smile, and every gesture carried meaning. In those moments, they realized that true companionship was not about grand gestures, wealth, or appearances. It was about seeing, understanding, and valuing another person as they truly were. The cowboy, who had long been accustomed to being observed rather than understood, felt an unusual freedom in her presence. He no longer felt the weight of expectations, the pressure to maintain an image, or the isolation that wealth and reputation had often imposed. For the first time in years, he felt seen and accepted, not for what he had built, but for who he was. The widow, in turn, felt the quiet fulfillment of connecting with someone who appreciated her honesty, strength, and resilience without pretense. They shared small moments of laughter, too, recalling incidents from the day. The spilled drink that had caused a brief scramble, the child who had run across the field with an oversized bouquet, and the uncle who had accidentally stepped on a dance partner's foot. These lighter moments provided a contrast to the deeper reflections, reminding them that life was a mixture of joy, sorrow, humor, and grace. It was in this balance that they found comfort and connection. As the evening deepened, the cowboy and the widow moved to a quieter spot on the ranch, just beyond the reach of the main gathering. The soft glow of lanterns and the distant flicker of a bonfire illuminated the landscape, creating an atmosphere of serenity. The stars overhead twinkled with a brilliance that reminded them of the vastness of the world and the smallness of individual worries. In this peaceful space, the conversation shifted from the past to the present, the moments they were sharing, the comfort of being understood, and the rare beauty of genuine connection. He reflected quietly on the significance of the night. The dance, the conversation, and the shared presence had reminded him that life was not only about achievement or survival, but also about experiencing joy, trust, and companionship. He realized that even in solitude, one could find unexpected connection if they remained open to it. The widow had not only offered him a dance, she had offered him a moment of trust, a glimpse of possibility, and the reassurance that human bonds could still be formed, even after years of isolation. The widow, for her part, felt a sense of hope she had not felt in a long time. She had approached him without expectation, without curiosity about his fortune, and without judgment. And in return, she had received a connection that was deep, meaningful, and unexpectedly comforting. She recognized that life could offer surprises in the simplest moments, a dance, a conversation, or a shared gaze under the stars. They sat together quietly for a while, letting the silence speak as much as words could. There was no need to fill the space with constant chatter. The understanding between them was enough. The cowboy felt a peace that he had not allowed himself to feel in years. The widow felt a renewal of faith in human connection, in the quiet power of sincerity, and in the beauty of shared presence. Eventually, they returned to the wedding, but they did so together, not as two observers, but as companions who had shared something meaningful. Guests noticed the subtle change in them, the way they moved with ease, the small smiles they exchanged, and the sense of calm that surrounded them. People whispered quietly, sensing that something important had occurred between the two, though no one could fully describe it. It was a human connection that transcended the ordinary social interactions of a wedding. As the night drew closer to its end, the cowboy and the widow found themselves reflecting on the day. They realized that wealth, status, and past achievements were irrelevant in moments of true human connection. What mattered was presence, empathy, and the willingness to step beyond isolation and fear. They had both taken small risks, she by approaching him without hesitation, he by allowing himself to be vulnerable. And in doing so, they had discovered a shared understanding that was rare, valuable, and deeply meaningful. The cowboy felt gratitude for the unexpected turn the evening had taken. He had arrived at the wedding prepared to observe, to remain distant, and to watch life continue without his participation. Instead, he had been invited into a moment of shared humanity, a gentle reminder that life could still offer joy, companionship, and unexpected moments of connection. The widow had reminded him that even after hardship, life could surprise, offering beauty in the most unassuming ways. The widow, too, reflected on the significance of the night. She realized that courage and openness were not only about facing hardship or building resilience, but also about allowing oneself to connect, trust, and be present. In reaching out to him, she had experienced the quiet satisfaction of making a difference, of creating a meaningful connection, and of reminding someone that they were seen and valued. As the final guests began to leave, the music fading into soft echoes, they remained seated together for a while longer. They watched the stars, the open fields, and the soft glow of lanterns, letting the quiet beauty of the night sink in. Words were no longer necessary. The shared presence and understanding spoke louder than anything they could say. The cowboy felt a sense of renewal, a small spark of hope that connection and joy were still possible. The widow felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that her small act of courage, the decision to approach him and dance, had created a profound moment that neither of them would forget. Eventually, the night came to a gentle close. The cowboy and the widow rose together, moving slowly and carefully across the ranch. Though the wedding was ending, the significance of the evening remained with them, a lasting reminder of the power of trust, empathy, and shared humanity. They had discovered that even in a world often focused on achievement, status, or appearances, there was profound value in simple, genuine connection. In the quiet of the night, as the ranch settled into stillness and the stars shone overhead, the cowboy and the widow parted ways for the evening, carrying with them the memory of a dance, a conversation, and a connection that had changed them both. Neither could predict what the future held, but both understood that life had offered them a rare gift. The reminder that human connection, trust, and understanding could bring light into even the most solitary of hearts. As he watched her walk away, he realized that the evening had not just been about a dance at a wedding. It had been about rediscovering a part of himself that he had thought lost forever. He had been reminded that life, despite its hardships and limitations, could still hold moments of beauty, joy, and human warmth. She had reminded him that even a billionaire cowboy in a wheelchair could be seen, valued, and truly understood. And for her, it was the same. She had approached someone who seemed untouchable to most, and in doing so, had experienced the quiet joy of connecting with another human soul. She had discovered that courage was not only about facing challenges, but also about extending kindness, trust, and openness to someone who needed it most. That night under the vast expanse of stars, two lives, shaped by resilience, loss, and quiet courage, intersected in a way that neither would forget. The cowboy and the widow had shared more than a dance. They had shared understanding, empathy, and the beginning of a profound connection. And in that moment, they knew that life, in all its unpredictability, could still offer moments of unexpected joy, hope, and human connection, even in the most ordinary of places.